Hi, everybody. It's Neil Schusterman with the fourth installment of my short story readings. And this story was not in one of my Mindstorms or Mindquakes collections. This one actually appeared in a book from Dutton Books called Twice Told. And the idea behind this book is that a bunch of authors were given a picture, a wonderful illustration, and we had to come up with a story based on that. And two different authors came up with a story for each one without knowing what the other one was doing. So the stories were very different. For instance, my story was my image was also done by David Lubar, and he had a story that was very different from the one that I did. But this is one of my favorite stories, and I want to show you the image. I don't have a copy of the book, so I'm going to be reading straight from my computer. But this is the cover of the book, and actually, the image that they used for the cover was the story that David Lubar and I had written stories for. So as you can see, it's an old woman and a bear, and I couldn't tell when I looked at the picture whether she was feeding the bear, whether she was scolding the bear. And in my story, what I tried to do is I tried to use everything that I saw in that image. So take a look at all the different things in this image because they all come up in the story. And as I said, it's one of my favorite short stories that I've ever written. And the story is called Smells Like Kafka. So here we are with Smells Like Kafka. Bettina Plinth was the victim of guilt parenting. Her father was a plastic surgeon, the best in East Renfield, and was constantly on call for emergency nips and tucks among the town's middle-aged elite. As for her mother, she was an iron social butterfly, which is to say that the party she spent most of her life planning defined society in East Renfield, and woe be to anyone who fell out of her good graces. This left very little time for child rearing, which is why Bettina lived on a farm in the outskirts of town with her great Aunt Sophie, who, having seen 7 of her own children to adulthood with minimal casualties, seemed best suited for the job. While Aunt Sophie pretended it was a grave imposition, she really didn't mind, as Bettina's presence was a welcome break from hot rum toddies and the home shopping network. Bettina spent her days at Ravenscroft Academy, her parents' own alma mater, and spent her evenings with Aunt Sophie, who always had a great deal to say, even when she didn't. The family Plinth had been cornerstones of East Renfield for 100 years, had a street named for them, and tended to wear their name like mink. No surprise, then, that Aunt Sophie's farmhouse was the only place Bettina felt free of the weight of her family name. True, Aunt Sophie had been born a Plinth, but she had escaped by marrying a farmer, going rustic, and shedding that mink for overalls. "You won't find any streets named after me," Aunt Sophie was proud to say. This was a sentiment Bettina shared, for she knew life was much more interesting as a footpath than a boulevard. Unlike her parents, she hoped no one would ever say that they had an office on Bettina Plinth. As for her parents, they were not terrible people, only terribly self-absorbed and overburdened by the magnitude of their lives. They did love Bettina and would come visit every Sunday to shower her with affection and presents. "Good to see you, dear. We've missed you so much. You're always in our thoughts. Was that my cell phone or yours?" Guilt parenting. They felt so terribly bad about not spending more time with their daughter, they showered her with every gift imaginable. This is how Kafka came to reside at Aunt Sophie's farmhouse. Kafka was a 150-pound teddy bear that filled a corner of Bettina's bedroom. His thick, brown acrylic coat was almost indistinguishable from the real thing, and his eyes were genuine imitation amethyst gems. He hadn't come with the name Kafka, just a little tag above his tail that said, "Made in Hong Kong." The name was Bettina's idea. Once, at one of her mother's parties, her mother had been talking to friends about literature and the many, many writers she didn't like. "Kafka's the worst of them," Bettina had heard her mother say. "I could never understand a thing he wrote." And so, when her parents presented her with the bear, she promptly named him Kafka, knowing that there must be some merit to something her mother couldn't understand. For most of his early life, Kafka would sit in the corner, a fixed gaze out of the window, staring at dazzling sunsets that would refract through his amethyst eyes. He would observe on the occasions Bettina brought classmates over, holding his silence as those children made snide comments, turning their noses up at Bettina's less than elegant lifestyle. He would say nothing as Bettina tried desperately to win the friendship of these privileged children who were used to having their friendships bought. "You can't get friends by acting like that," Marla Cockle had told Bettina. "You can't get friends by acting like you want them." Marla was a popular girl at school, who Bettina had concluded was exactly what her mother must have been like at that age. "You have to act like you couldn't care less," Marla had said. "Then people will want to be your friend." This tactic failed on every level because the snooty kids at Ravenscroft Academy were content to be ignored by her. Kafka, however, was always there for her in those moments she felt so utterly alone. She would throw her arms around him and cry, her tears running down his Scotch-guarded pelt. If she pressed deeply enough against him, his arms would rise from the pressure, and Bettina could imagine he was hugging her back. AuntSophie often hugged her. In fact, she made it a point to hug Bettina as often as possible. Still, it wasn't the same, because AuntSophie's years of child-rearing had left her on autopilot. Although Bettina knew AuntSophie cared deeply, those hugs by rote were like multiplication tables. "I look at myself in the mirror sometimes and I feel like there's nothing inside," she would confide in Kafka. "Nothing but stuffing." And perhaps that's why she came to feel him as a kindred spirit, as they quietly passed the days waiting for something in their lives to change. It was on the day her parents left for a long-anticipated Mediterranean cruise that Bettina's mother took her aside for a heartfelt talk among the clutter of knickknacks in AuntSophie's living room. "Listen to me, Bettina." Her mother always began her admonitions with the phrase, "Listen to me," much the way sermons and hymns always ended with, "Amen." "You need to try harder to fit in at Ravenscroft. Your teachers say that you do well in your studies. It's clear sailing academically, but in the other areas, in the personal areas, you seem to run aground." Bettina cast her eyes down at a paperweight that featured a horse within a glass ball nursing a foal. She picked up the paperweight and shook it. Snow swirled within the ball, and she wondered what self-respecting mare would nurse her foal in a snowstorm. "Bettina, are you listening?" "I'm listening, Mother." "Let me see your face." Bettina looked up and her mother examined her. "There's nothing wrong with you that a smile and some eyeshadow can't cure. Remember, it's not so much what you have as how you present it." Bettina was not an unattractive girl, but she knew her eyes were a bit too small for her face, and her hair defied the most determined of brushes. "Dad says I have good bone structure." "So you do, dear, so you do." Her mother ended their talk with a long, sorrowful gaze and a sigh. Amen. That night, the moon shone brightly through Bettina's window, reflecting off of Kafka's deep violet eyes as he lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her tears had long since frothed into anger. She clenched her fists until her knuckles went the pale color of her mother's makeup base. Through all of this, Kafka watched. To say that an object as inanimate as a cotton-filled bear could be watching or listening might have been scoffed at by her parents, but Bettina was sure that he did, because she was not beyond believing in the impossible. "There's magic hidden in life's secret corners," AuntSophie once told her, "but you kill it if you clean with pine salt." AuntSophie's wisdom often had to be taken with a grain of salt and sometimes Tylenol, but her view on magic was something Bettina had taken to heart. Bettina was sure, for instance, that the eyes of some old portraits truly did follow you across the gallery, that cameras did occasionally capture a soul, and that the most deeply loved stuffed animals were aware. "My mother wants me to be more like her, Kafka, but why should I want to be?" Yet there was a part of her that did want to be like her mother. As much as she hated her parents' world, she couldn't help but long for the perfect fit they made with it, like her mother's hand in a long satin glove. Bettina knew she was like a planet revolving around a distant but powerful sun. Either she would find the enormous energy she needed to break free from her mother's formidable gravity, or she would never reach that critical velocity and would end up trapped in orbit, becoming nothing but a poor imitation of her mother, and not who she wanted to be. If only she knew who she wanted to be. "What is it I really want?" she asked Kafka just before she nodded into sleep. His answer, as always, was silent meditation. Bettina woke the next morning to find her face being slimed by a tongue the size of a trout and smelling just as bad. She yelped, then screamed when she realized she was not dreaming. Leaping from her bed, she cowered in the corner. There was a bear in her bedroom. There was a living, breathing bear standing between her and the door. "AuntSophie!" she screamed. "AuntSophie, help me!" But AuntSophie was not waking for all the world this morning. She was several REM states away from consciousness, having gone on a home shopping network bender the night before until 3 a.m. Nothing short of the apocalypse would wake her this morning, and even then, the four horsemen would have to wait until she had coffee. With no help from AuntSophie, Bettina looked around for something to defend herself with, but her room was full of soft things, because her parents did not believe in supplying hard objects like, say, a baseball bat to a girl. It did occur to her, however, that of all the soft things in her room, one was missing. A rather large one which, until last night, had occupied the very corner in which she now cowered. The bear watched Bettina with curious, concerned eyes. Familiar eyes. Kafka? The bear sat back on its haunches the way he always did in his corner of the room. "Harumph," said the bear as his rear hit the floor. The boards creaked beneath him. It seemed the entire house bowed from his weight. Somewhere downstairs something fragile fell from a shelf and smashed. Yes, this was Kafka. There was no doubt about it. There was no other explanation, and Bettina thanked her lucky stars for having been chosen for this glorious, if somewhat pungent, miracle. She went up to Kafka slowly, reached out her hand, and brushed his fur, so soft and dense. Then she led him out of the room and ran down the stairs. With every footfall, something else fell from one of AuntSophie's many shelves of home shopping network and eBay purchases. A statuette of a sad child with oversized eyes, a plate with the likeness of John Wayne, a whiskey decanter in the shape of Frank Sinatra. Every step brought another casualty until Kafka sat in the living room where her mother had lectured her on the importance of presentation. "Well, what now, Kafka?" The bear responded with silent meditation. So Bettina turned on the TV, then laid back into him like a beanbag, and they watched Saturday morning cartoons. AuntSophie awoke at 11, cursing the foulness of mornings, believing they were God's punishment to mankind for everything he was likely to do during the rest of the day. Gripping the banister, she came down the stairs, assuming the gamey odor around her was some new manifestation of old age. When she arrived in the kitchen, she found Bettina sitting there with something very large that refused to define itself in AuntSophie's mind without her glasses. She reached above the refrigerator, slipped on her glasses, and was faced with a bear eating kibble out of her crystal punch bowl. AuntSophie sucked in a deep breath and held on to the doorframe to keep herself steady. "Kafka was hungry," Bettina explained, "and we had plenty of dog food." AuntSophie's dog, Geppetto, was a stubby little Lhasa Apso that was several hundred dog years old and was so territorial that he would often attack AuntSophie's furry slippers. But right now he just cowered outside of the doggy door, poking his nose through and barking, refusing to get any closer to the bear that was inhaling its kibble. It was common knowledge that AuntSophie had been known to nip at the NyQuil, as the neighbors put it. Thus, she was no stranger to unlikely animals wandering through her kitchen. Indeed, there was one time after too many vodka martinis that an entire zoo tramped through her house, singing selections from West Side Story. Usually those creatures didn't linger until the morning, however. You remember Kafka, don't you, AuntSophie? He's just a bit changed, that's all. AuntSophie was also a conscientious hypochondriac and was on a whole series of medications for ailments she no longer remembered. She clung on to that fact like a fine strand of sanity as she left the kitchen and returned to her bedroom to call her doctor, thoroughly convinced that this hallucination was brought on by the interaction of her medications. When the bear did not vanish as the day wore on, she had to acknowledge that he was real, which begged more questions than she had years left to answer. That bear must have come from somewhere, she told Bettina as they watched it wander around the yard. He came from my room. He's probably a circus bear. Someone will come looking for him. But they won't. And what if he's dangerous? Does he look dangerous to you? And actually, no. For all his size, it didn't seem like he would hurt a fly. There was no malice in his eyes, or in his ponderous body language. For most of the day, Bettina played with the bear, and AuntSophie watched dubiously from her favorite wooden lawn chair, too distracted by the sight to even change out of her robe. Like Bettina, AuntSophie was also not beyond believing in strange occurrences, and had to entertain the possibility that this truly was Kafka transformed. Bears simply were not seen in the woods behind her home, or anywhere in the county for that matter. And after all, just watching Bettina and the bear together made it obvious that their relationship went beyond the normal relationship between bear and child. She would pet him, and he would purr. She would scold him, and he would demur. She would praise him, and he would stick his snout in the air preening. She would open her arms to hug him, and he would pull her into his fur, hugging back, but not with a heavy, leaden bear hug. His arms fell so gently over her shoulders, Bettina could stand on her tiptoes. AuntSophie had been around the block enough to see a few miracles in her time. How her firstborn child was pronounced stillborn, only to revive when she held him in her loving arms and prayed. She had seen her brother hit by a truck at 17 and told he would never walk again, only to see him dance a soft shoe at a family reunion a year later. And she had unmistakably seen her late husband's spirit shining back at her from a newborn babe she saw in a park not a month after his passing. If these miracles were possible, who was to say if Bettina's miracle might not also be true? As for Bettina, she had quickly adopted this quirk of fate into her understanding of reality. I've made up a place for him in the barn, Bettina told AuntSophie. Well, that's all fine and good, but we're going to have to call someone to come take him away eventually. You know that, don't you? No, Bettina proclaimed. I'm keeping him. It's hard enough cleaning up after Geppetto. I'm not shoveling up after a bear. I'll do it. You say that now, but my boys had hamsters, and who do you think had to clean up after them? Right about now, Kafka came lumbering out of the barn and took an interest in AuntSophie's chair. They watched from across the yard as Kafka first sniffed at the chair, and then began to scratch at it heartily with his paws. AuntSophie ran toward him, screaming, and understandably so. This wasn't just any old chair, and Bettina knew not to even sit in it, lest its fragile wood give way. To hear AuntSophie explain it, the old wooden lawn chair was the last of its kind, the only surviving relic from Hachawana Lake Resort, where she and Uncle Walter had met and were eventually married. When Hachawana Lake Resort closed down, the hotel was bought by an exotic religious cult that worshipped trees. Hence, all wooden objects short of the hotel's timbers were burned. Fortunately, Uncle Walter had stolen the chair a year before the terrible Hachawana bonfire. The sentimental value alone was just this side of the Hope Diamond. You get away from that, you miscreant! AuntSophie yelled. The bear lumbered toward her, rearing up on its hind legs. AuntSophie wagged a furious finger at him. You go near that chair again, and I'll send you back to wherever it is you come from. Kafka roared back at her, but then strode away with his head held low. You didn't have to yell at him. They went to the chair to inspect the damage. There were gouges all over the right arm of the chair in strange, crisscrossing patterns. Look what he did. I'll never be able to repair that. Bettina turned her head slightly and took a long look at the gouges. She thought there were patterns there. It almost looks like writing, kind of like Chinese. AuntSophie frowned and studied the gouges, brushing away the splinters. Don't be ridiculous. It's not Chinese. It is so. Bears don't write. It's a known fact. And besides, why would he write in Chinese? Bettina crossed her arms. Didn't you ever read the tag on his back? He was made in Hong Kong. Word spread quickly that Bettina Plinth was now the proud keeper of a brown bear who wrote perfect Chinese, and since the closest thing to a Chinese person in town was the Hawaiian woman who ran the local donut shop, no one could disprove the claim. People from miles around made pilgrimages to the farm to see the bear in his mysterious runes. Later that week, Bettina attempted to bring Kafka into Ravenscroft Academy, only to be turned away at the gate. Still, the appearance of Bettina walking a bear on a little green leash became grist for an overactive mill. The image alone was enough to make Bettina the center of attention, and add that to the mysterious Asian scrawlings, and Bettina became a star. By the end of the week, she would walk into the lunchroom and all the popular kids would sit with her, asking a million questions. How much does he weigh? Did he ever bite you? Does he like Chinese food? And although every day AuntSophie threatened to call animal control to haul him away, she never did. For 2 weeks it went on, until the evening before Bettina's parents were to return from their trip. In the late hours of that night, the moon spilled a creamy glow across all it touched, as comforting as warm milk. While AuntSophie snored off the last of her latest eBay binge, Bettina crept out to the barn and snuggled against Kafka's fur. The bear purred, the sound so deep it rumbled in Bettina's bones like a wave crashing on the beach. It should have been a perfect moment, but Bettina was still filled with an indefinable longing. They like me in school, Kafka, she told him. Everyone's my friend now. But it felt like a guilty confession more than anything else. The kid's interest was in Kafka, not in her. She was merely basking in his mysterious light. And while it was fun to bask, she knew the adoration of the kids at Ravenscroft Academy was a flicker that would soon die. Yet it didn't bother her, for she also discovered that as much as she longed for friends, those kids were not the friends she longed for. They were all cut from the same mold as her parents, old money and new clothes, snob mongrels, AuntSophie called them. She took a deep breath as she leaned against Kafka, filling herself with the powerful scent of bear and the musty aroma of hay that filled the barn. Her parents would not approve of Kafka, and she wondered what tomorrow would be like. No doubt her parents would arrive tomorrow morning with a carload of guilt offerings from their cruise. On a normal day, they would come and then they would leave again. No big deal. Only tomorrow would not be a normal day. In the 2 weeks that they were gone, she had grown into a different person. Witnessing Kafka's transformation had made her demand change in her own life rather than just longing for it. Her spirit had been kindled by him, and she felt herself ready to ignite. No, her parents would not approve of this at all, and she wondered if it was their approval she wanted. Is that what was missing in her life? What do I want? She asked the bear once more. Even in this moment where she could have been content, she felt needy. I need your strength, she told Kafka. Strength enough to figure out what I really, really want. She had always been manipulated and tossed by the forces around her, but here was this bear, this glorious beast, mighty and powerful, yet at her command by its own choice. He had been sent to her for a reason. She had to believe that, because fate and magic were two sides of the same coin. We're all victims of fate, AuntSophie once said. Thank God for insurance. If Kafka's arrival in Bettina's life was something destined, then it meant he was more than fur and stuffing, more than flesh and bone even. He was a spark of something much greater than that. What are you, Kafka? She whispered. Why are you? Kafka shifted his big, dark eyes, catching the moonlight glinting through the door. As she looked into those eyes, she began to feel as if she could fall into them, as if they weren't the eyes of a bear at all, but a window to her own soul. She stared deeply into the light of those eyes until she finally understood what she truly wanted. By the time Bettina's parents arrived the following morning, the crowds had thinned at the white chair to a couple of neighborhood kids who poked sticks in the dirt trying to create their own bear language. Bettina sat on the porch swing, watching her parents get out of the Mercedes, their hands too full of international booty to open their arms for a hug. "Darling, we missed you. You would have loved the Acropolis. We sat at the cabins table. We thought of you in Venice." Venice stepped down from the porch and opened the picket gate for them. "Welcome back, Dad. Welcome back, Mother." Her mother turned her face to the side for a kiss. Bettina obliged. "High time you got back," AuntSophie shouted as she came out into the porch. "It's been Animal Planet around here lately." Mrs. Plinth beamed, mistaking Sophie's meaning. "You've been having friends over from Ravenscroft, then?" She noted the neighborhood children playing around the chair near the barn. "Some," Bettina admitted, "but mostly it's just been me and Kafka." "Oh." It was an "oh" weighty with disappointment. "Which reminds me, we need to have a word with you about Kafka." Her parents gave each other a mind-reading sort of look that like surgeons over a fading patient. Then Dad put down his gifts and went to retrieve something else from the car. Bettina took a deep breath. Her heart pounded with what she was about to do, but she did her best not to show it. "Mother, I've given it a lot of thought and I've made up my mind about a few things." Her mother deposited her load of gifts on the porch swing. "Whew, I'd forgotten the humidity here. It's much drier heat in the Mediterranean." "I know how you'll feel, but I will not take no for an answer," Bettina said. "Of course, dear." She turned toward her husband. "Ah, here it is." Bettina followed her gaze to see her father returning from the car with something large, furry, and very, very pink. "Here, what is?" But as her father approached, she saw exactly what it was. It was another huge stuffed bear, but this one had fur the color of AuntSophie's artificial sweetener packets, and the smile just as artificially sweet. "It's to replace Kafka," her father said brightly. "But I don't want to replace Kafka." "That model was recalled, dear," her mother explained. "It was too realistic. Apparently it was frightening children to death." Bettina could only stammer. "Besides," her father said, "this one's better. It's programmable." He squeezed the bear's paw, and the bear said, "Hi, I'm Candy Bear. Enter username, please." Bettina shook her head violently, trying to jar her resolve back into place. No, you can't take Kafka. I won't let you. He won't let you." "What are you talking about?" Bettina turned toward the barn. "Kafka," she called. The bear didn't come. AuntSophie sat on the porch swing, and Geppetto hopped onto her lap. They waited to see what would happen. "Kafka!" Bettina called again. Her mother rapped her nails on the porch railing. "Bettina, stop this. You're being ridiculous." And then Kafka came. He slowly lumbered out of the barn, and the neighborhood kids playing near the lawn chair scattered. "Is that a bear?" Her father dropped Candy Bear with a thud, jarring loose an eye which rolled off the porch steps. Bettina turned from Kafka and locked her gaze on her mother, who was transfixed by the approaching bear. "As I've said, I've made a few changes and a few decisions," Bettina said. "I've decided that I want parents, real parents, and I believe you can make the transformation. So I'm coming home with you today." No response from her parents, only frozen gazes over her shoulder. "You have room for me at home, but you don't have time, so from now on, you'll make time." By now, the shadow of the bear had fallen over her own, as Kafka reared up behind her, not so much eclipsing her shadow as merging with it. "My God," her father said, but made no move. "I'm leaving Ravenscroft Academy. I'll attend a neighborhood school, and I'll play with neighborhood kids. We'll have dinner together. You will ask me how school was each day, and I will tell you just fine, because it will be." She felt Kafka's breath on her back, and the softness of his fur as he wrapped his arms around her shoulders from behind and, and hugged her gently. "I'm your daughter, not an inconvenience. Is that clear?" Her father nodded immediately. Her mother held out. "I said, is that clear, Mother?" Kafka roared, nearly blowing Mrs. Plinth back through the screen door. Yes, Bettina," she said. "Not an inconvenience. AuntSophie, do something!" AuntSophie rocked gently on the porch swing. "Ain't my bear." "And one more thing," Bettina said. "From this moment on, I refuse to call you Mother. From now on, I will call you Mom." "You can call me Dad," her dad offered, but then she had always called him Dad. "Well, Mom, what do you say?" Her mother finally met Bettina's eyes. She might have been quite the iron butterfly, but she was no match for the bear. "All right, then," Mrs. Plinth said. "You'll come with us today, and we'll have AuntSophie send your things." Bettina gently tapped Kafka on the paw, and he dropped from her shoulders. She knelt to him and gently rubbed his fur, then whispered into his ear so that only he could hear. "Thank you, Kafka," she said. "You can go now." The bear took a long look at her, into her. Then he grumbled a bit and sauntered toward her father, who backed away. Kafka bowed his head, but only to clamp his teeth onto the arm of the pink bear on the ground. "Hi, I'm Candy Bear," it said. "Enter username, please." Kafka swung around and dragged Candy Bear out of the gate. Together, they disappeared into the woods. "Well," said AuntSophie, "don't that beat all?" "What on God's good earth was that?" her father asked, still dazed by it all. AuntSophie stood up. "I'm still not sure, but you owe me for 210 pounds of dog food." Bettina felt no sense of loss in setting Kafka free, for she knew that she was taking quite a lot of the bear with her, but leaving AuntSophie would be harder. "There will always be room for you here, dear," AuntSophie said. "Unless, of course, I put in that pool table." She gave AuntSophie a kiss and a bear hug that almost pressed the wind out of the old woman, and the hug Bettina got back from her was anything but rote. Her mother put her arm around her as they turned to go. It was the first time Bettina could remember her doing it. "For your information," her mother said, "I never insisted that you call me Mother. That, my little grizzly, was your idea." Then Bettina Plinth, good bone structure and all, triumphantly marched to the car with her parents, knowing that her family's transformation had already begun. The end.